So this is not going to be a video about how you're not practicing enough, and it's not going to be a video about how you're not willing to accept constructive criticism, and it's not going to be a video about how you're focusing too much of your attention on camera gear. However, it will be a video about the, illusion or the perception of improving one's photography. And it's something I hear quite a bit about, especially from those that are just getting started in their first couple years of photography. And frankly, it's something I've been struggling with a little bit as well recently. But I've come to the conclusion now that I believe the entire thing is really just it's a mind game, if you will. It's a perceived illusion of improvement. It's not really based on any actual facts of the matter. Let me explain exactly what I mean. So when I was in my first full year of fully dedicated landscape photography, my perception of a great image for me was when I simply nailed the focus. I was obsessed with image clarity and image sharpness, and I spent months zooming in and zooming out of my photographs trying to determine whether or not I actually nailed the focus. It was like 50-50, it was pretty hit and miss back then. But once I became more comfortable and confident in my ability to achieve sharp focus in each and every one of my landscape images, I no longer use that as a measuring stick or a barometer, if you will, as to whether or not an image of mine was actually great. And the reason I share that particular story with you today is because I think when we first get started in our first couple years, our photography skill set, our advancement, our improvement is filled with those types of monumental gains in a very, relatively short amount of time, honestly. Now, have you ever heard the phrase, "The rising tide lifts all ships"? The rising tide lifts all ships. I think that saying sums this topic up absolutely perfectly. And I organized this video into three separate parts where a photographer's skill set is represented by the tide, and the ships are represented by a photographer's expectations and their comparison to others. So to jump right into it, as far as a photographer's skill set is concerned, if you compare this to the, say, construction of a home, when a home is in the early stages of construction, the foundation is poured or it's created. And then walls are constructed and the walls are raised up on top of the actual foundation. And then the roof is built and the roof is placed on top of the walls, which is placed on top of the foundation. And all this happens very quickly in a relatively short amount of time. But then after a couple additional months passes, you look over at that house and you start to realize that the progression has appeared to have slowed down. You don't see the monumental changes that you once did in the very beginning. And what's interesting about this is more than likely the progression has not slowed up at all, but the progression has shifted from the big details, the roof, the walls, the foundation, and has shifted to the smaller details of the property, things like the plumbing or maybe the electrical wiring. And although these details are just as important as the big items in the very beginning, they give you the perception that the progression has slowed because these details are not as obvious to see. And when I look at this analogy and compare it to my first 7 years of landscape photography, I can absolutely see the glaring resemblance to my own progression. And what's interesting about it is when you first get started, you focus on the big things. You focus on things like, how do you work your camera? How do you achieve sharp focus? How do you properly expose an image? How do you change the shutter speed on your camera? What are the foundational kind of best practices for creating a good composition when you're on location? And then once you become more comfortable with these items, it's natural to shift your focus to the more granular or the smaller details of photography, like paying attention to the histogram to ensure you're not clipping your highlights or crushing your shadows, because you know that when you do that, it's going to make post-processing that image that much more difficult. Or when you're on location, you know to look for distracting elements that are creeping into the side of your frame, because you know that when you get that image back home, you're going to have all these kinds of distracting elements that are along the edges of your image. And it feels like you're not progressing as much because the progression on those smaller details is not as obvious as the big changes you saw in the very beginning. But the interesting thing about progression is progression's progression. Whether you're progressing on the big things or the small things, it might feel a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, it's the exact same thing. Now, as far as a photographer's expectations are concerned, so you have the tide, which is a photographer's skill set. And as that rises, it's also going to lift up a photographer's expectations. And as the higher a photographer's skill set goes, so do the expectations with it. So the rising tide lifts all ships. And the interesting thing about expectations is usually by this stage of the game, and I think this is where my personal feelings of stagnation really started to occur. But at this stage of the game, you've been into photography for a couple years now, getting pretty confident with what you can create. You're starting to feel good about it. But what's interesting, and this happens to me all the time, and let me know in the comments section also if this happens to you as well. I'm curious if I'm in the boat by myself here, but I can't tell you how many times where I go on location. It'll be a beautiful location. I get amazing conditions. I come up with a composition I'm really happy with. I walk away with an image I'm very proud of. I get home, I put a fantastic edit on it. I share it all over social media. I get great feedback. I put it on my website. Maybe I even print the image out. And then maybe 3 months or 6 months pass, and I start to look at that image again, and I no longer like it nearly as much as I originally did when I first created the photograph. Now, did anything change with that image? No, it's the same exact image. But what did change was my personal expectations of what my work should be or what my work is. And expectations, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It can be a good thing, but it can also be a real detriment to the way that you view your photography. Because the way that you critique your own photography now is completely different than the way you critiqued it in the very beginning. You know now to look for different things. You expect better from yourself because your skill set has risen. And if you fast forward, I should say 5 years from now, I guarantee you, if you stick with photography, your expectations will be substantially higher in 5 years than they are right now. So as your skill set rises, so do your expectations as well. Now, for the final component of this is comparison, your comparison to others. And as your skill set increases, so does your expectation of your photography, and so does the amount of comparison that you put onto other people. And in today's digital age, we all have access to hundreds of thousands of the most amazing photographs from some of the most amazing photographers all over the world. And it's pretty easy to naturally compare yourself to these photographers. And the photographers you follow on social media, more than likely, they are fantastic photographers. Otherwise, you wouldn't pay attention to them. And I'm not going to be naive and say that you shouldn't compare yourself to other people, because it's kind of built into humans' DNA. We compare ourselves to other people. We are constantly benchmarking ourselves to determine how we're progressing in something based off of other people. So it's very natural for us to do that. But I think a better way, or a more healthy way, is to not compare yourself to the best photographers in the world, but to compare yourself to an earlier version of yourself. And what I've done, and it's really helped me out, is I created a folder on my desktop. And I placed, I think, maybe 12 or 15 images from my first, I believe, 6 months of landscape photography, that at that time, these were my favorite pieces of work. I was very proud of these images. And every time I start to feel a little bit blasé, a little bit down on my overall progression, I open up this folder and I start to review some of the images that I created when I first got started and compare them to where I'm at right now. And that is a great way to really realize how far you have come in your overall photographic journey. Because when it comes to comparison, comparing yourself to other people, it doesn't matter how strong you are. There's somebody out there that's stronger than you. It doesn't matter how good looking you are. There's somebody out there that's better looking. And it doesn't matter how great you are at photography. There is somebody out there that is better than you. So comparing, it can be a dangerous pitfall to fall into. But I think comparing yourself to an earlier version of yourself is perhaps the most beneficial and positive way, and a great way to just be kind to yourself overall, I suppose. So I hope that this video provided a little bit of additional information. That I hear about this a lot recently on YouTube, and I've read quite a few articles, and I think this happens in the summertime a lot, where people start to feel a little bit uninspired. They start to feel a little stagnant in their photography, like they're not progressing as much. And I do think a lot of it has to do with the season. It's summertime, it's hot outside, everything is green, there's not a lot of color contrast anywhere. The atmosphere is usually pretty hazy, and everything just looks kind of flat and dull. And it's pretty natural to start to feel a little bit down on your overall photographic progression as to where you're at right now and where you wish you were in the future, or where you wish you were right now as well. So, like I said, I do hope you enjoyed this week's video. Something a little bit different, something I've been struggling with as well, and it appears to be something that other people might be struggling with as well right now. So I hope this video did help someone out. Now, if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up, it definitely helps the video perform better, helps the channel perform better as well. And of course, it's greatly appreciated by myself as well. And subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, and ring the bell notification just so you are notified the next time I do upload a video. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.